Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 29 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about the different list controls that are available in ASP.NET. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 26, 27, and 28 of this video series. In ASP.NET, there are several list controls that we have been discussing so far in this video series, like drop-down list, checkbox list, radio button list, list box, and bulleted list. All of these controls inherit from list control class, and this fact, because of this fact, all these controls are actually a collection of list item objects. And we can add list items to any of these controls in the HTML source at design time or in the code behind file programmatically at runtime, and all of them supports data binding. Okay, now let's drag and drop these controls and see how similar it is to actually add list items in the HTML source. So I have these 5 different controls here. So let's paste this HTML onto the web form. Let's select that and format it properly. Okay, so all we have here is the 5 different list controls: drop down list, checkbox, radio button, list box, and a bulleted list. Now we know that all of these controls are actually a collection of list item objects. So adding list item objects to these controls is very similar. All you have to do here is to copy paste the list items. That's all. So the only difference here is the tag name. Okay, so now if you look at the design, look at that, all of them are populated with these list items. So it's very similar to work with these list controls. Okay, so this is the drop down list. We have the checkbox list with all those 3 list items: radio button list, list box, and the bulleted list. Okay, so we have seen how to add them at design time using the HTML source, and it's very identical. The only difference here is the tag name. Now let us see how to actually add items programmatically. And again, if we want to add programmatically, first we need these tags. So let's add them now. Okay, so we have these controls here. Now we want to add the list item objects programmatically to these controls, and obviously the way we do it is we need a method to add these list item objects. Now since there are 5 different controls, do we really need 5 different methods? One method to add list item objects to the drop down list, another one to checkbox list, etc. We don't have to. If we understand the concepts of inheritance properly, then all we need is one method, and we can reuse that method. So if you look at this here, I have a method called add list items method, and this method is taking in a parameter list control. Remember, all these controls, drop down list, checkbox list, etc., all these controls actually inherit from list control class. So we are using the parent type as a parameter for this add list items method, and what we are doing here, the implementation of the method is pretty straightforward. All we are doing is spin up 3 list item objects specifying their text and value, and then we are adding those list item objects to this list control. And then look at how we are using this method. We are actually passing in the drop down list, checkbox list, radio button list. Okay, so depending on to which list item, to which control you want to add these list items, you're passing in the ID of that control. And it's possible because all these controls inherit from the list control class. In fact, inheritance is used at its best here. If somebody asks you an interview question like, where can you use inheritance? Can you give me a practical example? You can give this example. Let's say I want to populate the list controls. We know that all these list controls inherit from the list control base class. Rather than having different methods to populate these 5 different list controls, we can have one method doing that. And we use the base type as the parameter, and when we actually use it, we use the inherited type. And we have spoken about inheritance extensively in C# video series. If you haven't watched that, I would strongly encourage you to watch the video on inheritance and polymorphism, which tells you that a base class reference variable can actually point to a derived class object. That fact is allowing us to pass in the derived class object at runtime. Okay, let's see this in action. So first we want a reusable method, so let's create that method. I'm going to use private as the access modifier because I'm going to use that only on this web form, and let's call this populate maybe items. And then the trick here is we use the list item, the base class here, list control, the base class for all the list controls that we have in ASP.NET. So list control, and what we want to do, we basically want to create a list item object. Li is equal to new list item, and let's call this maybe item 1 is the text and the value is 1. Let's actually say li1, li2 and li3. All we want to do at this point is to add these list items to the list control. So list control dot items dot add, and we want to add li1, li2 and li3. So li2, li3, that's it. And the way we use it is on the page load. If it's not post back, we call this populate items, and then if you remember on the web form we have all these controls which we want to populate. At the moment they don't show anything because there are no list items. We want to add them programmatically, so we can pass in the IDs of those controls, drop down list 1, checkbox list 1, etc. So drop down list 1, I want to populate that, and along the same lines we want to populate the checkbox list, and so checkbox list 1, and we want to pass radio button list 1, list box 1 and bulleted list. Okay, so now when we run this at runtime, it should programmatically add these list items to all of the controls that we have on the web form, and it works. So because of this fact, base class reference variable can point to derived class object. Because of this fact, we are able to reduce the amount of code that we have to write drastically. Instead of having 5 different methods to populate these 5 different controls, we just have one method now. Now let us see how to actually retrieve the item. Now depending on the type of control. Now if you look at these 5 different controls that we have, some of them allows multiple selections, whereas some of them only allows one item to be selected. For example, drop down list, you can select only one item. Checkbox list, you can select more than one item. Radio button list, again only one item. List box, depending on the selection mode. If the selection mode is single, then you can select only one item, whereas selection mode is multiple, then you can select multiple items. Whereas bulleted list, you cannot select, you can only click on one item. That too if the display mode is set to link button. Okay, so depending on the type of control that you are using, you can either select multiple items or one item. If the control supports multiple selections, then you probably have to loop through each list item and then retrieve the text value and index of that list item. But whereas if the control allows only one selection, then it's enough if you retrieve that one selected item. You don't have to use a for each loop to loop through each item. Okay, let us see again how to write a reusable method which can do that. Now if you look at this, it's again pretty straightforward. Retrieve multiple selections. There is a method called retrieve multiple selections, and if you look at this, it's taking in a list control parameter, and then what it's doing here, it's using a for each loop to loop through the list items within that list control, and then retrieving the text, value and index, and then printing that out using this response.write method if that list item is selected. So this method can be used by a checkbox list control and a list box if the selection mode is multiple. It will also work with radio button list and other controls, but this is not the best code because there is unnecessary looping through each list item. If it's a control that only allows single selection, then this reusable method works best. Okay, retrieve selected item text, value, and index. And what is this doing? We know that all list controls have selected item property and selected index properties. Okay, so we are essentially using that properties and then retrieving the selected item text, value, and index. Okay, let's quickly see how to write these methods and use them. So let's say private void, and I want to get multiple selections, and obviously we are going to pass in a list control. So if it's a list control that supports multiple selections, then we have to use a for each loop to loop through each list item. So for each list item, li in list control dot items, if li dot if the list item is selected, then what we want to do, we want to retrieve the text, value, and index. So text is equal to li dot text, and then maybe we want to put a comma and a space, and then specify value is equal to li dot value, and then we want the index, so comma space index is equal to, how do we get the index? List control dot items dot index of that list item, and since index is an integer, convert that to string, and then put an HTML break so that each selected item will come in its own line. So that's it. So we have this one method, and then we can use this method to get the selections of a checkbox list or a list box, if it supports multiple selections. Now let's say we have the list box here. Let's set the selection mode to multiple. Alright, so now let's put a button control there. Let's drag and drop a button control onto the web form, which when I click, I want to get maybe the selected items text, value, and index of a list box control. How do we do that? Instead of writing my own code again, we can use that method get, what did we call the method as? Get multiple selections. Get multiple selections, and then it is expecting a control to be passed in. If you want to get the the selections of a list box, pass that in. When we run this now, and then when we select some things and then click that button, so I have the list box here. I have selected, okay, we haven't changed the text here. Let's change the text to item 2, item 3, and let's call this 2 and 3 just to give it some sense. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, so I have item 1 and I selected item 3. I click this button. Look at that. When we click this button, it's going to call this get multiple selections method, which will invoke this method, and we get the text, value, and index. So I've selected item 1 and item 3, and you can see the text, value, and index there. Now on the other hand, let's say I want let's run this now. If I don't select anything here, let's say there's a checkbox list. I select these items, I click this button, nothing will be printed because I haven't selected anything in the list box. Let's say when I click this button, I want to find out what are all the items that are checked. Then I use the checkbox list instead of list box, or you can call both of the methods. Whatever is checked, that will be invoked, and that information will be displayed. So I have item 1, item 3, I click this button, and I see the text, value, and index of those selected items. Now let's see how to write the method, which supports single selection. Here we don't have to use a for each loop. We can just use the selected item and selected index properties. Okay, so let's call this method private void get single selections, and then as usual we pass in the base class type, which is list control, and you need to verify if the selected index not equal to -1. If the user has not selected anything, then you shouldn't try to retrieve the text and value properties of selected item, because selected item will be null and you might run into a null reference exception. Okay, so if you want the text, response.write text is equal to, how do I get the text? All you need to do is list control dot selected item dot text and then put an HTML break. That's it. And if you want the value is equal to list control dot selected item dot value and then the HTML break. And if you want the index, we can make use of the selected index property. So list control dot selected index dot toString. Get rid of this HTML break, and that's it. So now we can invoke this method maybe on the button click. Let's say I want to get a single selection of the drop down list. I can pass in the drop down list object, or I can pass in maybe the radio button list, whatever. So now when we run this and drop down list, let's say I have selected item 3, I click this button, so item 3 value is 3 and index is 1. Okay. And in the previous session we have actually seen how to retrieve the the text value and index of the bulleted list upon which you have clicked. For example, if I have a bulleted list and if I have set the display mode as link button, then the bulleted list supports the click event. So whenever the user clicks on a specific list item within that bulleted list, then we can tap into that click event and retrieve the text, value, and index. We have seen how to do that in the previous session of this video series. On this slide, you can find the resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.